How would you respond to those critics that say he's a leftist? He doesn't like this capitalist meritocracy that you're describing.
So, couple things there. First of all, socialism, or having to describe communism, socialism, I don't think Christians have any problem with that if it's just me being super radically generous to the poor. Right. I've never heard a Christian be like, you can't give your money away. You gotta hoard it and like build a skyscraper or a statue to yourself. Like, Christians are totally okay with radical, and always have been, by the way, statistically, the actual data, I know that the stereotype is Christians are greedy and capitalist, whatever. The actual data shows that conservative evangelical Christians give like twice as much as any other religion. Maybe Mormons give roughly comparable amounts, but they tithe at double the rates of secular people, progressives. So actually, Christians are following at least.
There aren't many hospitals named after atheists.
Exactly right. Yeah. So number one, I've never heard Christians say you can't be radically generous with your money. What Christians have a problem with is the government taking your money to be generous with your money. I think that's a different discussion entirely. Jesus is commanding his followers to be radically generous with their own possessions. He's not advocating for the government to just take your stuff and do that stuff that you're supposed to be doing yourself, which is a challenge to us as Christians. I think in a society where we feel like we're overtaxed, we're like, well, the government will do that for me. And I'm like, no, Jesus says you need to go help the poor. You need to take care of widows and orphans in their distress. You need to do those things, not just outsource that to the government. So I think we're mixing categories here. Jesus is not prescribing socialism as a political system. He's talking about our attitude as believers who follow him. That's one obvious thing. The other thing too is that I know people like to, even Christians can do this, they read the red letter text of the Bible, meaning the stuff that Jesus actually said while he was on earth, and on Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Gospels. But Jesus inspired the whole Bible, right? He didn't just inspire stuff in the Gospels. He inspired Paul's letters and Peter's letters, the Old Testament. And so we have to look the whole sweep of Scripture and say, what does it talk about? It does talk about radical generosity. It does, just all the time. You have to care for the widow and orphan, protect the innocent, the vulnerable. God's a father of the fatherless. But it also talks about laziness and good stewardship of our resources. Paul writes to the Thessalonians, he says, if you don't work, you don't eat. He doesn't want us to become lazy and entitled. I'm not saying that's a message for non-Christians per se, but it is the biblical principles that no, God expects you not to just mooch off of others. Now, it's not to say that we shouldn't be merciful and compassionate. It's just there's more than just like the red letters in the Bible too. And I would even argue those red letters directed primarily to Jesus' followers and how we should respond personally. He's not talking about how the government should organize society. And somewhat relatedly, I've seen that many Christian pastors who fall on the far left of the political spectrum, they will take biblical quotes so remarkably out of context. And this is a quick plug for why it's really important, whether you're Christian or Catholic or Jewish, you should absolutely read the Bible in Hebrew, because one of the quotes they use so often, which really bothers me, is they'll say, we will be a sanctuary for illegal immigrants. We're not going to cooperate with ICE because we're told to love the stranger. But in Hebrew, the word is ger, and ger is sojourner.
Exactly. It really is not the illegal immigrant that Jesus was referring to. Let me ask you one last question. You began this conversation somewhat dismissive of lived experiences, and I'm sympathetic to that as well. I don't think lived experiences trump empirical truth.
Yes.
Having said that, though, Christianity and religion itself very much does require relationships and emotional attachments of sorts. How would you respond to African Americans or even African American Christians who say that your critique of critical theory, in particular critical race theory, does in fact dismiss their lived experiences?
So I think the word you used was trump, not in the President Trump.
Yes.
But the problem is lived experience trumping empirical evidence. That's the problem. I mean, lived experience can be a source of knowledge. Like if you ask me, what's the best restaurant in Durham, North Carolina? I'd tell you through my lived experience of the restaurants, right? So you can get knowledge, and that you don't have it because you live in Los Angeles. So the point is, absolutely, lived experience can be a source of knowledge. But if I claim the best restaurant is this restaurant, and you're like, it doesn't even exist. It's the wrong state. You could say, well, that's my lived experience. I'd say, no. We have to hold up your lived experience to the scrutiny of one, objective reality, and also the Bible. So where we get this, it's very clear this is a problem with gender ideology, where people's lived experience of their gender trumps the actual evidence of their chromosomes. That's the sort of the best example of lived experience trumping reality. and they demand that everyone bow to their lived experience as, say, the other gender, when we're not allowed to push back and say, no, you're not a woman, you're a man, and you should embrace that as your identity that God's given you. So I think that's the problem. And we have, I think a lot of the issue also is that Christians very rightly reject racism and actual sexism, and because we realize, again, the Bible says we're all created in God's image, that God redeems people from every tribe and tongue and nation. And I think that a lot of Christians who are sympathetic to critical race theory, they think all that critical race theory is teaching is that racism is bad, right? And I would just urge them, if that's they think of it, is to read actual primary sources by critical race theorists themselves, who will say outright that critical race theory from its inception has been about seeing racism, sexism, and heterosexism as all forms of oppression that must be dismantled simultaneously. I mean, you have lines from like Ibram X. Kendi, who says, you cannot be an anti-racist if you're homophobic or transphobic. You can't be. Like, you don't even call yourself that, because you must be on board with feminism, anti-capitalism, he says, anti-transphobia, anti-homophobia. All of those things are part and parcel of not just his weird theory. The earliest critical race theorists will say that. And again, if you're skeptical of those claims about critical race theory, I've written 2 books with my co-author, Dr. Pat Sawyer, with thousands of words of primary source quotes. And we come down very hard on actual racism. It's wrong. It's evil. And the history of race in America is terrifying and bad. And we should grieve over that. We can do so while maintaining a biblical view of race, gender, and sexuality.